I had worked as a direct support person in an institutional setting, and we had caused sufficient trouble that they let us take a number of people, a big number of people, and set up a group home for people that today would be called dually diagnosed here in Syracuse. And after I lived there for several years, I went back to school, and then I became the manager of a psychiatric rehab program. And we had students from SU, and in return for that, we got free credits that we could take at Syracuse. And this Wolf had just come, and he was teaching a course called Social Advocacies. And I had never heard of him. I was, for whatever reason. And I thought, well, that looks like an interesting topic, and the time works. So I walked into a classroom in the building where the center is now and saw, in those days, 2 overhead projectors and this guy with all these cards and files and things. And that's when I met Wolf. And he misinterpreted a piece of the book of Revelation in the process of his lecture. He made a mistake about the Greek of it, actually. And so I corrected him. And after the class, I said, it happened to be a mistake in the way that you read that. And he said, that can't be. And I said, well, I think so. And then he said, we're doing a PASS workshop next week, and you must come. So I said, okay. And that was the second PASS workshop that the Training Institute had put on. And that's where I learned about normalization. That's where I first heard the word. In that workshop, Wolf actually led a team. And the way the workshop went, there was this kind of very intensive lecturing, a rather complex theoretical construction of the principle of normalization broken out into 40-some dimensions. And then you went to visit a real service. In our instance, it was a small group home that was operated by the local Syracuse Developmental Center, the local institution. And a little team of us did that, and then we applied this PASS instrument. And it was a very intensive process, stay up late into the night sort of thing. And Wolf was our team leader. He was the person who actually engaged us in the process of applying this tool that he and Linda Glenn had written to these 2 services. And I am of a sort of theoretical bent myself. My formal training is actually in philosophy. And then I picked up a degree from SU in something social administration because I thought I'd better understand something about the job I was doing. But I thought, well, this is a very interesting system, but in particular the way that it applied in the actual lived experience of this group home and the kind of analytic power of Wolf's mind applied to this particular place actually taught me a lot. The theory would be something that you could puzzle over or pick on, but the actual using this set of lenses as a way to appreciate what real people are living, and also then to think about, so what would make this work better for the people involved? That's what hooked me completely. I think if it had just been a sort of theoretical thing, and if I hadn't had the opportunity to be so close to Wolf thinking about this, because this was before the thing was all finished. We were using a copy of this that had been either it was mimeographed. It was black and white, not those purple ditto sheet things, but it was literally made just for this workshop. It wasn't even a fully printed book yet, and so we had a chance to kind of watch him. I had a chance to kind of watch him think, and watch him apply what he was thinking about to a real situation. So it was literally I walked into his first class as a professor at SU, and I couldn't figure out, all the other people were sort of, wow, Professor Wolfensberger, I don't know who this guy is, but he needs help with his Greek. I knew that. No, I had taken a class with Bert Blatt, or two. I had had a fair amount of contact with Thomas Zass. This was a sort of a cauldron of kind of new ideas about psychiatry, about intellectual disability, mental retardation, about services and how things worked. And I had been a lot more identified with the mental health side of things. That's one of the reasons I think I'd probably never heard of Wolf. But it was also a time when there was a considerable demand for the training, and he was very skillful at engaging people. So I finished the workshop. He had a little conversation with me and a number of other people in the workshop after the thing was over, and said, "We'd really like you to come back and be a team leader. We've got another workshop in a month," or whenever it was. And so I said, "Okay, I'll do that. I'm interested enough in this that I'd be really curious to." So he was kind of building his bench, pretty quickly. So Mike Hogan, who's here today, who's now the mental health commissioner, was in the workshop, I think. Several other people that have kind of stuck with it for years. Well, the way the workshop's structured, people work in teams of 8 or 10 or sometimes even 12, and so there's a team leader and an assistant team leader, and so Wolf actually stepped back very quickly. I think it's one of his real gifts is, Darcy said this morning she'd never had anybody have such high expectations of her, right? So if he thought that you had potential, then he moved as quick as you would take it, more responsibility to you. So he did very little of the actual teaching. He would kind of table at the front of the room, perpendicular to the people in the group, and the person who was presenting the workshop would sit at that table, and so would Wolf. And he would do what he called jump ups if he thought a point needed further clarification, or there needed to be something else said, or you'd screwed it up. But he moved very fast. So by the second workshop, even in the first one, he had somebody else carrying a lot of the lecture part of the workshop. And after the workshop that I went to, I don't think he led a team ever again. So again, he'd kind of float around and check in, see how things were going for you, have a look at, listen in for a while, and then offer some comments or just kind of move on. So he had around PASS a very, very systematic approach to developing people. And, as I say, would expect of you as much as you would give him. Well, again, in the time that I was most active, a lot of the ways to teach normalization were being developed. If you're familiar with the PASS instrument, right? It's a very carefully hierarchically organized system. So there are things to say about each thing, and you're trying to teach people in the presentation part of the workshop the ideas that you want them to think about, the ways you want them to think. But the real learning, in my view, happens in the team process, where people are engaged around, well, we visited this group home or whatever, and now let's have a look. Physical integration, local proximity, where is it? And where is it in relationship to, sort of the center of a local population? And then where is it in relationship to a region? And you think to yourself, well, what the hell is this all about? But he had examples, and the examples obviously grew the more of the training we did, right? So you could say, well, isn't this odd? A lot of the people who live here aren't from anywhere near here. They're not even, they're sort of at the opposite edge of the jurisdiction that they live in from where their families are. Isn't that odd? Well, that would make it harder for people to visit. So it's that particular learning experience was multi-layered with, for me anyway, the main body of the actual figuring it out being, well, how does this apply? Does this really mean anything for the people that we met? What might it mean? And because part of the genius of the thing was a rule that said, you're using this approach to describe what's there, not why. And from my point of view, that's one of the most powerful practices in this whole body of work. So yes, there are 9,000 reasons why, it's in an old convent, miles from anything, off a bus route. I'm just thinking more about this location thing. There's a million reasons for that. Doesn't matter in terms of its effect on the people with disabilities who live there. It's still hard for people to get to them to see them, still hard for them to get anywhere. Their lives are different than they would be if somebody had been mindful about the way that they situated this place. So, yeah. So there was a good deal of room at the beginning in the first several years for trying to figure out, well, what is the best way to teach people about this? What's the best way to explain this? And Wolf, in fact, was reasonably, he had lots of other things that he was really working hard on. He, until the early 80s, put a lot of energy into a human service planning workshop, which I also had a chance to to be a part of. He had a sort of a residential services workshop. He had a whole set of different approaches to things. And for several years, he was happy enough to have several of us just try to figure out what's the best way to teach this, and let's get on with it. He changed his mind about that, but one of the things that I think changed is that that as time went by, there was more experimentation about how to teach this, and inevitably more variation. And I think Wolf, one of the big differences of perspective and practical differences between Wolf and me, not that my differences matter that much, but one of the big differences, Wolf always, I think, or for a very long time anyway, saw pass and passing as kind of intended to be proper evaluation instruments of research. And he put a great deal of energy into thinking about the scores. So the way the thing worked, you had a 5-level system, and different of the ratings had different weightings of points and so forth. And I think his idea was that this would function as an evaluation tool that funders would use to decide who got money and who didn't. And in fact, that's what PASS was originally created for, is a way for the Nebraska Developmental Disabilities Council, I think, to decide about grants, right? They just came into being and had some money. And so he wanted a way to make sure that the grants were allocated to projects that were consistent with the principle of normalization, which was the foundation of the work that he and many others had been doing in Nebraska to create the NCORE system and to revolutionize really the service system there. So his picture was always, this should be a kind of scientific instrument. And that never made any sense to me, frankly, for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, as I say, I don't think my argument should have won, but I could never figure out, why would you think that would help? Why would you think that having a kind of way to measure quality in a quantitative way, why would you imagine that would substitute for people's commitment, people's inventiveness? It never made a lot of sense to me. So I never had a stake in teaching people to score the thing properly. I thought we need the discipline, right, of people being serious about what they judged to be the level of quality of whatever dimension we were looking at. I certainly was all for that. But I think Wolf decided that it needed to be a lot more standardized. It needed to be a lot more sort of tightly administered. So that's the point at which we didn't continue after. Well, that's actually not a difference between me and Wolf. That's a difference, for example, between Gunnar and Wolf. So Gunnar would be a firm proponent of the Bob Bogdan's grandma rule and say, Bank Mickelson kind of had it right in the first place. This is about giving people a life that's as good as anybody else's. What more do you really need to know? That's not quite what Gunnar thought, but that's the position that he would hold up both in public and in private conversations, at least with me. My sense of it, and this is of very little use, I think, to what you're trying to do, but to answer your question, the devaluation of people with disabilities is so subtle in its construction, not in its result, but in its construction, right? That we need sensitization to the multiple dimensions through which people are oppressed by devaluing social processes. A lot of Bogdan's grandma words there. Let's imagine Bogdan's grandma is pretty well read. So if you think about what the center was doing with its qualitative methods and human abuse seminar, for example, you've got powerful demonstration in, for example, Steve Taylor's doctoral dissertation on a ward at Rome State School, or Doug Bicklin's dissertation on behavior analysis treatment program. They immersed themselves for hundreds of hours, wrote literally 1,000 pages of very detailed observational notes, worked their way through it, worked it through it again, discussed it with colleagues, dissected it, argued about it, and came up with very powerful accounts of how these particular settings didn't work for people. My sense was that for many people, what the principle of normalization as it was defined in PASS did was to help that process to happen in a week. Not to the same degree of subtlety, not to the same depth, but you could begin to see how many different things were misaligned with the stated mission of a service program. So this group home is here to give people a great life and help them develop their potential and help them be part of the community and all that, right? So those words were contested in the 70s. There were people who, would say the institution's really a community anyway, and all that kind of stuff. But mostly the words were already there in lots of ways. And so you would think, oh, okay, so this is as good as it gets. What PASS and normalization gave us the opportunity to do in a very powerful way was to show all the ways that that prejudice against people with disabilities kind of seeped in through the cracks and created a setting that defeated itself. So one of the ideas, one of the things you look at if you look at things with PASS is, how many people are there here? Well, it turns out if you even have what doesn't seem like a very big number at all of people, and you look really carefully about the effect of the way that the way that number works, you begin to discover, well, geez, Jerry doesn't ever get to do what he wants to do. He's always part of this little group of people because that's the way the place is set up. Well, that's kind of different than a place that's committed to Jerry's potential and treating him as an individual and all that, isn't it? And then you begin to think, well, geez, does Jerry have any people in his life? Is he part of, much of anything? Well, he's kind of part of this little group, and then they get in the van and go to the day center, and he's kind of with us. And geez, these guys are like the crew of a submarine. They're kind of trapped in this little circuit. Oh, okay. Well, so what are they getting out of it? Like, surely people are working really hard to teach them a lot of stuff. Well, no, not really. If we actually look at it carefully, there's not that much that seems all that relevant to Jerry. Not very intense what's happening in the way of, programming or treatment. It looks like more like a lot of kind of busy work and stuff than, and he's kind of putting screws in packages, and then there's people on the other side of the table taking the screws out of the packages. What's up with that? So it gives you, sort of 42 windows to look through. And in a typical human service program, what you see through each of those windows begins to pile up to say, this is a setting that's reproducing the devaluation of people. And because we've got 42 different windows to look through, we can say, well, in terms of kind of respect for age and culture appropriate dress and appearance and stuff, Jerry looks pretty good. He's got a nice watch on, he's got a tasteful blue shirt, he's got leather shoes, he looks pretty good, he's clean, he's, good work. But about this social integration thing, about this, who are the people in his life and who's really trying to figure out something that would really matter to his life and helping him to learn it, that's not happening. So we give him okay on appearance, and then we have to say, social integration stuff, that's right down there in the cellar. That's, appearance is maybe a 3, which means they're probably not doing any harm, but gee, this other stuff, this looks like kind of like a 1. This is kind of like this is actively taken away from this guy's, development, personhood and stuff. So it isn't that it substitutes for the subtlety of Steve's doctoral work at all. But it was, for me, a very straight road for people to say, wait a minute, the kind of change that we need here is just a whole lot deeper than I thought when I came in on Sunday night. And it's going to take more work of a different kind than we thought it was. And for me, that was the payoff. That was the reason to put the time into doing it, not we have now prepared, kind of raters who are ready to go to take a reliability test and then go out and score programs and give funders the scoring and that kind of stuff. And again, it was just a real tactical difference of opinion. So that was actually a big part of it. The other part for me is I'm not a big fan of evidence-based practice. I think most of that is just nonsense. Not about specific treatments for particular medical conditions. I'm happy that people pay attention so that I can get by just fine for my heart failure with, and the generic drugs that my doctor prescribes are just as good as the way more expensive. I'm perfectly happy that the Emory Medical School pays close attention and says, nah, this will work just about as well as that. No, we don't think you need a big expensive heart operation. We think we can do okay. That's okay with me. I'm even not too unhappy with the idea that it's a good idea to check out therapies that are supposed to be specific to particular activities. But the things are way too complex for there to be an evidence base for what to do about whatever you get to call autism, for example, because by and large, that's a category that's It's a basket that's so big that you have no idea what you're talking about, right? And if you think about Bob Bogdan wrote a paper a long time ago, 70s, early 70s, I think, about, is inclusion a good idea? You might as well ask, is Tuesday a good idea? I mean, it's not a scientifically negotiable matter. Kids belong together. You either believe that or you don't. Once you've decided that they do, then you got a lot of problems to solve. Some of those problems yield to the collection of data about whether what we're doing is working. No doubt about that. But whether you can generalize from that, I am very suspicious. Well, I actually left Syracuse right after Wolf came. I was on my way out of town, actually. I had just the one semester when I took that course before I moved to Georgia. And I moved to Georgia because Governor Carter had brought a group of people from New York State to set up his human service and particularly the mental health and developmental disabilities department. And one of those people was my boss in New York. And so he asked me to come to Georgia to help out. So I was on my way when I met Wolf. So the work that I did with Wolf, I continued to do into the 80s, and I did it by getting on the plane. So I kept working with Wolf well into the 1980s, I think, 83, 4, 5, something like that. And I actually helped design passing the implementation of social role valorization, although its first edition didn't have that name in it. So I stayed, Wolf and I didn't part company for quite a long time after I left. And I came to Minnesota, for example. Connie and I did for ARM to do pass workshops and so forth in the late 70s, early 80s. Harold, can't remember his name. Well, it's, as I say, it's complicated, and I think it's your judgment what to do with it. My way of thinking about it would be Wolf underwent an enormous shift in his belief about what was possible. And I mentioned that we had this workshop about planning comprehensive services, and there were lots of controversy. There were lots of things that I could argue about in the details of it, but again, it was another one of those experiences that in 6 days gave people a real opportunity to kind of grapple with what would it really be about to have a regional service system that made institutions unnecessary and actually functioned and kind of delivered on some of the stuff that we wanted. And Wolf had spent an enormous amount of very creative energy in thinking about the answer to that question, or the answers to that question. And some of it was embodied in NCORE in Nebraska. Some of it was embodied in the ComServe process or the ComServe proposal in Canada. And I worked with the then National Institute on Mental Retardation in Canada alongside my day job and alongside my work with Wolf. All those things were kind of interpenetrating, and one of the reasons people wanted me to come to Georgia was because of my connections with these other places. Wolf came to the conclusion, the insight, and my sense of Wolf is different. Hank Bersani this morning talked about how rational Wolf was. I don't believe that I don't know this, but I've never thought that was his primary way of knowing. I think perhaps he's one of the most deeply intuitive people I've ever known. I think he could see things, see the whole of things. And then he could kind of pull them apart into lists. And he came to believe that although the principles that he was teaching were universally valid, okay, the world had degenerated to the point that they couldn't be implemented. Now, Wolf and I never agreed about universally valid principles from my personal point of view, also from my point of view as a philosopher. All of those things were so abstract as to be almost trivial. But Wolf genuinely believed that there was a scientific root to an objective universal truth. I'm a lot more in the Bogdan, Taylor, Bicklin school of social constructionism, right? I think, we have the pragmatic possibility of continuing to understand better and do better, but that Plato was wrong. There aren't some forms that the philosopher king can see. And so Wolf was concluded that it can't work. It can't work. Then, because he has had a very subtle mind and a very complex mind, he said the only hope for normalization is if we separate the value part from science. And so SRV is purely an empirical, objective, scientific theory. And I thought, well, I got only 3 problems with that. I don't think there is such a theory. I don't think empiricism matters all that much, frankly. It's certainly a subordinate thing as far as I'm concerned. And I think that the thing that has moved the field is people's hearts as they integrate with people's minds and their bodies. I think that's where it comes from. I think what hooks people in a positive way and gives them a shake is in this tiny little bit of time. If you structure the role right, people can encounter a person with a disability, even in this artificial workshop situation, in such a way that they begin to see, just catch a little tiny glimpse of the whole way that this person is excluded and the intricacy of it. And they can get a sense of, that's a waste, that's wrong, that's morally bad. And we're freaking stuck. We don't know how to get out of it, right? It isn't like, oh, and here's the management technique, you just change the way you do the staff rota or whatever, or you move to shared living, or you create smaller group homes, or to me, all those things are like good tries. And they go somewhere when they're rooted in a sense that, oh my God, what we're doing now is just nowhere near right. But the human tragedy of the matter is that no matter how smart the people at the University of Minnesota are, no matter how clever their analysis, no matter how detailed their task analysis of the direct support job, it's not enough. You can't send out for the answer. And if you go to those places like a couple of the providers in Region 10 where people seem to have be on a better journey, it's imperfect as hell, right? It doesn't check off on all the checklist things, and people are scratching their heads, and people are looking at each other sometimes and saying, "Oh my God, she's in jail again. What are we?" Or she set fire to the place again, or he took a whack at somebody again. What the hell are we going to do now? Those are the moments of truth at which you stumble a little bit forward or you get stuck. So for me, it was always a tragic situation. It still is that we're in together, and it's all part of the fact that we're mortal, we suffer, we die. The people that we love suffer and die. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you were a really kind of rationalistic person, kind of puzzling story, right? So Wolf and I disagreed about not the details, because SRV is theoretically approximately the same. If you look at the ratings in passing, they were written by porting the material in pass into a different framework. Arguably an interesting framework, maybe even in some way a better framework or a clearer framework. I could buy that. The thing that I couldn't get with was, this is all about science. This is all about social science and empiricism. I think social science is by and large a kind of a nonsense. To imagine that it's the same as provides the same insight as the engineers who designed your camera is just silly. That's not what human life, as in the kind of messed up way that I know it, is all about. They can't engineer it. People either are faithful to each other and to what they believe, or they're not. And lots of times we can't live up to what we think is the right thing, and we got to figure out what to do about that. And the forgiveness that people with disabilities are willing to extend us for our imperfections and our errors is the only thing that saves us. So I have continued, just as I did when I was closer to Wolf, I've continued to do what I learned with him, which is to get in there with people who are trying to figure out how to do it better and see if I can help it get a little more clear or figure out a next step. And along the way, we've developed sets of practices that can sometimes help people get a clearer sense of what the point of the whole thing is, or get a deeper, or try a new experience, or redesign, reorganize, get back on track. So we spend, Connie and I, lots of time just trying to be with people and organizations and say, so what's up? What's next? What's in the way? Can we notice any ways that we're defeating ourselves? Are there any things we're doing that we actually could do differently that are getting in our way? And the answer to that is pretty often, yeah, this is getting in our way. Well, let's not do that again. What would it take for us to not do that again? And sometimes we've got a reasonable answer to that question. And as people were talking about in the last session this afternoon, you could say, well, the payment mechanism's buggered up because it just reproduces a set of really unfortunate mechanistic power relations. So let's scramble that up. Let's give the money to the people and their families. See what happens. I don't think that that's a, sort of final total answer, but I think it's an interesting thing to try. And so far, when we've been able to get beside people who have the courage to try it, some really interesting things happen. And it turns out to be hard. And it turns out to be hard to sustain. And some of the problems are still there. We still have trouble hiring good people and keeping them with us because of the amount of money we got. All that. when people are kind of in a groove about it, it engages people's resilience and their creativity. That's what we've seen in the Make a Difference process that Beth and I have worked on. That when that works okay, and somebody actually does form a relationship with a learning partner, direct support person really does form a relationship with a learning partner, and crosses that boundary between service land and the big world outside, around even the littlest thing that really matters to that person. That is scary. That is entangled in ways that make you feel like Gulliver with the Lilliputians, with the 9 million little threads that are binding you to the ground that you have to figure out something to do about, but enormously energizing. Enormously energizing.